now I'm going to ask Ingrid to come to the podium and introduce our two guest speakers today.
With pleasure. I think it's fair to say that what we're about to experience is one of those silver linings from the pandemic. Having transitioned to the virtual world thanks to Zoom, we're now able to connect with people beyond the borders of San Diego, including ARCS members from other chapters, like at our last virtual field trip to San Diego, friends and supporters from across the country, like at our last Scientist of the Year virtual event, and scholar alumni around the world, like today. Dr. Jeffrey Drazen, our first speaker, is tuning in from Hawaii, and Channing Prend is tuning in from Paris. Who would have predicted this time last year? We have truly come a long way, thanks largely to our fearless leader, Holly Heaton. So Holly, brava. We really have come a long way.
Thank you so much, Ingrid.
Back in 1997, when our chapter was just 12 years old, Jeff Drazen received an ARCS Award while working towards his PhD at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. That year, Becky E. Tess was the president of our chapter, and she's still a member today, although I didn't see her on the call. Jeff went on to earn his PhD in 2000 in marine biology at SIO. He then took a position as postdoc fellow at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute up in Moss Landing, California. And in 2004, he joined the University of Hawaii at Manoa in Honolulu, where he's currently professor of oceanography and where he teaches several courses on deep sea biology and related fields. He also runs a deep sea fish ecology lab. So Jeff's half-hour talk today will be about understanding the environmental risks of deep sea mining. He'll be followed afterwards by a short presentation by Channing. So Dr. Drazen, over to you.
All right, well, thank you all very much for inviting me to speak to you today. One moment here and let me share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see the large screen now? Is that okay?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. The ARCS scholarship that I received when I was in graduate school was really key. It enabled me the freedom to pursue the things that I wanted to when I was in graduate school, and really is a big part of leading to me to through my career. So I wanted to share with you today some of the research that myself and my students and other lab members are doing. And we're trying to sort of understand the environmental risks of a new field called deep sea mining, which some of you have probably heard about. So I'll start off introducing you to the deep sea. This is the biggest ecosystem on the planet. If you look at the inset on the right and you see all the blue, and I've centered it on Hawaii, which is where I am right now, you can see just the extent of the oceans. And it turns out that 65% of the Earth's surface actually has water on it that's deeper than 200 meters, or about 600 feet. So all of the oceans represent, below this depth, represent about 85% of the living volume on Earth. It's truly massive. Indeed, the average depth of the oceans is 4,000 meters. So if you prefer to think in feet, that's about 12,000 feet, or about 2.3 miles deep. So when we go to the beach, it's when we go and we visit the ocean normally, we're really just visiting the skin of the ocean, and there is so much more below it. It's not all the same place. The habitats are as varied as they are on land or in shallow water. There are plains and mountains and canyons and trenches. And this place, as you can see from the larger picture with this rat tail fish and these little pink sea cucumbers that my cursor is on right now, this is a pretty unusual place to most of us. It's cold, it's dark, it has crushing pressures. It's very low food because there's not enough light to sustain photosynthesis from phytoplankton or algae. And so it does seem quite alien. But these conditions are actually the norm on Earth because, again, this is the largest living space. It's huge. And life abounds in the deep sea. The animals and other organisms that make up the deep sea represent about 50% of the mass of life on our planet. So that includes microbes. And there are as many species that are living in the deep sea as in very diverse places that we hear much more about on the news, such as tropical rainforests and coral reefs. And these are just a few of the animals that we've studied in my lab that represent some of this amazing biodiversity. It is clearly the last frontier on our planet. This image on the top is a king crab that we caught off of Honolulu, the Waianae coast. It's just to the west of Honolulu, a city of 1 million people. This thing is not a small creature. Right below it is a snailfish. Both of these are, well, the top one is likely a new species, and the bottom one is a new species, brand new species. So we are finding all kinds of things in the deep ocean, and they're not just little obscure worms, and they're brand new to science. They say the surface of the moon is better mapped than the bottom of the ocean. That is true. There's a program called Seabed 2030 that hopes to actually map the bottom of the ocean at 80-meter resolution in the next decade or so. It's been estimated there's 1 million new species waiting to be discovered. And importantly, we're still trying to understand how our activities as a human society might affect this large ecosystem. And this is something down at the bottom here. I say the deep sea is out of sight and out of most people's minds. And this is something that I hope to help remedy partly by speaking to you all today. You can't go visit this place. It's not like the kelp bed or the coral reef. You can't go scuba diving in it. And it's dark and it's hard to visit. And many of you may have observed the deep sea on nature specials, BBC's Blue Planet, things of that nature. But for the vast majority of people, they can't see it, they can't visit it, and so they don't ever think about it. And it turns out that our society is actually connected to the deep sea in ways that many people don't understand. We garner natural products from the deep ocean. This picture on the top right is a pile of whale bones on the seafloor, actually in Catalina Basin, not far from where you are right now. And a very inventive scientist isolated bacteria from these bones. And those bacteria do a fantastic job of breaking down the oils, the fats in those bones under the very cold deep sea temperatures. And they thought to themselves, well, we should probably figure out how to utilize the enzymes that they'd use to break down these fats. And they did that. And those enzymes are now in many laundry detergents so that you can run your laundry and get the grease out of your clothing without having to run the laundry on the warm or hot cycle. You can run it on the cold cycle. On the bottom is a forest of corals off of Hawaii. One study looked at these and found a number of compounds in those corals that have anti-cancer activity. It doesn't mean they will turn into drugs, but there's promise. We also eat a number of deep sea fish. I think a lot of people may have eaten some of the fish I've pictured here. This is, you won't see them whole in the market. This is a rat tail. Nobody wants to eat a rat tail, so they renamed them grenadiers. These fish live between 800 and 2,000 meters off of California. Here is a thorny head. This was a big fishery off of Northern California. There's still fish for them. And over here on the right is an opa, which is very popular in restaurants right now. I bet you can get it down at San Diego Harbor at some of those restaurants. And this is actually a deep sea fish. So we eat organisms that live in the deep sea. And it turns out that many of our fisheries for other species that we don't think of as deep sea, such as these tunas here. And on the top, we've got some billfishes, swordfish. A lot of them actually partake in this complex food web, shallow water to the top, deep water on the bottom, the little things on the left, the big things we eat on the right. And what happens actually is that a lot of these organisms, these small fishes and squids that are in the middle of the food web, they hide out in the dark, down deep during the day. And a lot of the things like tunas that we like to eat have evolved strategies to dive to depth to chase after them. So big-eyed tuna dive to 600 meters to feed. Swordfish dive to 1,000 meters to feed. And so we're connected in that way. The next time you're enjoying a plate of sashimi or getting a poke bowl, you need to remember that the fish that you are eating basically place you just one step in the food web away from crazy organisms like those on the left, this lanternfish and this viper fish with teeth that actually extend above its eyes. So we are connected to the deep sea. And now I'm going to talk to you about a new industry, another potential new connection between our society and the deep sea, and that's deep sea mining. I'm sure a number of you have heard about it, but I still find quite a few people have not. And so I'll go through some of the basic reasons why people are considering mining in the deep ocean. There are three main types of deposits. On the left, you can see this chimney with all this black billowing stuff coming out the top of it. There are places on the Earth's crust where the oceanic plates are spreading apart and the magma is very close to the seafloor. And so water percolates through the rock, gets superheated, dissolves lots of minerals out of the rock, and then gets launched up through these chimneys. When that hot mineral-laden water hits the cold ocean, all those minerals come out of solution and they create this smoke here. That comes down onto the seafloor, settles to the seafloor, and over many years creates sulfide deposits that are rich in gold and silver and zinc. In the middle, we have a coral garden on top of an underwater mountain or seamount. And if these underwater mountains are old enough, meaning tens of millions of years, over long periods of time, minerals from the ocean will stick to the rocks. And so down here on the bottom, you can see light colored rock and then this thick black crust on top of it. That crust has cobalt and nickel and copper in it. Over here on the right on the abyssal plains at depths of 3,000 to 6,000 meters, the same kind of thing happens. You get lots of metals, minerals, and they will glom onto a shark tooth or a grain of sand, and they will build these potato-sized structures that look like rocks called manganese nodules. As the name implies, they've got lots of manganese in them and also iron, but they again have cobalt and nickel and copper. And so it turns out that these in particular, with all the cobalt in them, companies want to mine these because we make batteries out of those metals. And as we transition to renewable energies, as everybody wants a new iPhone or a new iPad, we need batteries. Cobalt is a key ingredient to the cathode of a lithium-ion battery. And right now, if you want to mine it, the two places that it's available are China and the Democratic Republic of Congo in any content. And so those are politically and socially challenging places to mine. So people have become interested in the deep sea. This is not new. People have been interested in mining the deep sea for decades, but it is taken off in just the last few years. This map shows where these mineral deposits are distributed. It's a bit of an optimistic map, I have to tell you, but in blue are all the areas where there are manganese nodules. In yellow, where there are underwater mountains with these crusts on them, or the potential to have those crusts, and in red, and those are all the sulfide deposits. I'm mostly going to focus on talking to you all today about the nodules down on the abyssal plain, and in particular, there's one spot here, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. There may be many other blue places on this map, but actually the mineral content in the nodules there is not very high, and so their feasibility for mining is quite low. But the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in particular, this is located, the arrow is pointing to Hawaii, so this is sort of between Hawaii and Mexico. It is a very large area with high numbers of these nodules, and they have quite high metal contents. So if we take a look, focus your attention first on the inset on the bottom here. If we take a look at this Clarion-Clipperton Zone, Hawaii here on the left, just the corner of Central America on the top right, all of these colored patches are existing mining claims. They're actually exploration licenses. They're issued by an international body called the International Seabed Authority. And if we take all of these claims, there's 26 worldwide, 17 of them in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, the lion's share for sure. But if we superimpose all these on a map of the continental United States, you get a sense of the scale. These claims span an area from California to Pennsylvania. They actually make up over 1.5 million square kilometers. All of this area basically is now destined to be strip mined. The mining equipment is massive. So these are actual vehicles that were designed by a company, Nautilus Minerals, to mine sulfide deposits off of Papua New Guinea. That didn't end up happening because the people there decided against it. The scale's huge. Right here, these are 2 people in yellow safety jackets. And so you can see these vehicles are the size of houses. This equipment is every bit as big as the equipment you would see at a big open pit mine on land. It's huge. This is a vehicle here on the bottom that the Japanese have been using recently. They did test collect mining off of Okinawa for 2 days in January of 2018. And just last year, middle of last year, they went to an underwater mountain and did some test mining there. Now, I want to emphasize the mining hasn't started yet on an industrial scale, but clearly it is poised to begin. The vehicles have been built, the claims have been posted, and so it has come to quite an advanced stage. So what is this going to do to the environment? And that's where my work and the work of many others comes in. And I can tell you a bit about how the mining will occur, but not in any great detail, because the technology involved in mining and those vehicles I just showed you, that's all proprietary for obvious reasons. So I'm going to tell you about it in very general terms. And I'll focus again on the mining of the nodules on the abyssal plain. You can imagine a collector vehicle down here on the seafloor. It will drive across the bottom, and it's going to remove the top 5 centimeters or so of the mud in swaths about 5 meters or wide or more. And then all of that, all the nodules and all of the mud and seawater with them is going to get shot up a pipe to a surface ship. Once there, that ore will be separated and the seawater and unwanted mud will be pumped back into the ocean. So clearly that's going to remove all the nodules, and so that's a habitat. And so that destroys a particular habitat where the mining occurs, and it is going to kill the animals that live in the sediments or the mud, the in-fauna. There are some suggestions that these vehicles will be quite heavy and they're going to compact all the mud underneath them, so it probably will alter the geochemistry of the seafloor as well. Based on some economic models, we estimate that an individual license will have to cover 300 to 600 square kilometers a year. So that's about 10,000 square kilometers over 15 years. And I remind you, there's currently 17 of these licenses in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. Now, these plumes of mud will be kicked up because the mud on the seafloor is so very fine, and it's going to take a long time for that to settle back down to the bottom. And that will increase the potential impact of these mining activities. And we think that the mud will bury animals. These are really clear ocean waters in the middle of the Pacific. They rival the clarity of water you see in the Antarctic. And normally, mud settles to the seafloor at a rate of a few millimeters every 1,000 years. So these big plumes of mud, when they settle out over days and weeks, may bury animals in ways that they just can't cope with. We expect that thus that these areas of effect might be more on the order of 50,000 square kilometers over 15 years of a license's operation. That's the size of the nation of Costa Rica. It turns out that the CCZ fauna is surprisingly diverse. These are pictures of animals we photographed in a portion of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. We've got shrimps here in the top, a variety of fishes, which are really in my wheelhouse, sea cucumbers here on the right, sponges, which are attached to the nodules on the seafloor on the top right. If you move to the bottom left, this amazing anemone is in a new suborder of anemones. Its tentacles are 3 meters long. It's just fascinating. It also lives attached to the nodules. There's some deep water corals, like these guys down here towards the bottom, and a whole host of other organisms. In fact, in just surveying a couple square kilometers, we observed over 300 species of these large animals. And it turns out about half of that diversity lives on the nodules themselves. Over here on the left, we've got this fascinating sea cucumber. It has a sail, bright yellow, and that it doesn't actually live on while it sort of moves across the nodules. When I talk about those living on the nodules, they're actually attached. So they're more like the corals and sponges and anemones. I do a lot of work on the larger top predators in the system. And so this video here on the bottom right shows a number of the rat-tail fishes that we observe in this Clarion-Clipperton zone. These are bright red shrimp moving across the seafloor here. And when we take a look at the diversity of these animals, we attract them actually with a piece of bait on the seafloor and put a camera in front of it. And this little chart here at the top in brown, this is the diversity in this mining zone, an arrow pointing to its location. And we compared the diversity of these big scavengers, fishes and shrimps and things, to these other areas on the globe indicated by stars. And indeed, it's the most diverse place we've observed. A lot of this diversity probably derives from the fact that there are nodules. And the diversity isn't just the big organisms, it's also the animals I showed you in the last slide, and animals living in the mud. The nodules provide an additional habitat to just the plain mud of the deep sea floor. And so with that habitat diversity comes species diversity. So how might these systems be impacted? I've hinted at that already a little bit. There were a number of studies, and they were started quite a few years ago, to create some simulated impacts to the seafloor to see how things would recover over time. And the picture that you're looking at right here is a track that scientists, a sled that scientists drug over the seafloor, creating this track. It didn't actually take any mud or nodules back to the surface, but it certainly disturbed the bottom. And you can see the nodules to the right and the absence here. And you can see kind of these fresh little crumbles along the edge of the track where the sled pushed the mud to either side. Scientists came back to this track 7 years after it had been made, and they took a look at the animals that live in the mud, and they found they had only returned to about 15% of their abundance from what they were before the track was made. They really had not recovered. The test mining tracks here look really fresh. And the question is, well, how old is this actually? And I'll just get right to it. This track is 26 years old. There are actually some other tracks now that have been seen like this that were made 37 years ago. This is not like driving your car across the lawn in your front yard. Your lawn repairs itself probably in a few months or maybe a year.
The ARCS.
This deep sea environment is very stable and current speeds are very slow. And so the system does not recover quickly. It may take certainly decades and maybe centuries for the communities to recover from this level of disturbance. I did some work on fishes in one area. They used this plow pictured in the top right, and they drug it across the seafloor in this, if you look at the map here on the left, this little disturbance area. And then they had a reference area away from this where they did no plowing. And I looked at the abundance of fish in these areas. And again, this is the second chart I will show you, the only one. This is the density of these fish. And these bars show you that in the reference area, and even where the plow was towed, this region, there are areas that are unplowed and fish density is still high. But 26 years later, if you look directly in the tracks, overall fish density hasn't changed. But this, in the dark bars, that's this little fish here on the right called Ipnops. It's a funny little fish. It's about 3 inches long, has a pair of reflective eyes on top of its head. It's the most common species of fish in this region, and it doesn't like the tracks. That's because it eats little worms and clams from the mud, and those animals haven't come back in the tracks. This plow's not very big, and you can find tracks and then a few meters away, undisturbed habitat. In industrial mining, the tracks will be considerably larger and whole swaths of the ocean may be removed. And so my point with showing you this data is that it isn't just the little things in the mud or on the nodules that can't get out of the way of the plows that will be affected. Even some of the top predators or top trophic levels in the system, like fish, will be affected for decades because their food web will be totally disrupted. So the potential risks to these communities: the destruction of unique habitats, species and biodiversity loss, alteration of ecosystem functions. There's a lot to consider here. But there are conservation measures that have been put in place and that are still being considered and talked about. The International Seabed Authority, that UN created entity that manages this, requires that these companies involved in the mining do ecological study. And they set up all these red boxes on this map, and those are no mining zones. And they were originally set up by scientists, and a number of them were more in the center of all these colored shapes, because that's where most of the nodules are, and some of them got pushed to the periphery. But they have created these. And a number of us have been busy trying to study them to find out whether they actually are a good conservation tool. And so with that, I want to show you a short video. This was put together by a technician in my lab, so it's not professionally created, but it will give you some insight into what the system looks like and what some of our research is about. So I'll hit play, and if someone, Ingrid, just confirm that you can hear the audio.
Yes. Sounds good, Jeff.
Okay, great, thanks.
Vast areas of the deep Pacific are targeted for seafloor mining. Yes, these are some of the most poorly explored habitats on the planet. The life of the abyssal seafloor, depths of 5,000 meters or about 3 miles, is weird and wonderful. They're animals with novel adaptations, sailing sea cucumbers, predaceous sponges. Yet most of these species have never been collected and are new to science. One of our main project goals is to explore the biodiversity of this region, to understand how they will be impacted by mining activities, and in particular to assess how areas set aside from mining, protected from mining, are adequate to preserve the biodiversity of this vast region. Why do people care about mining in the deep sea floor? Well, it's covered in some areas with black potato-sized structures that are full of valuable minerals: nickel, copper, cobalt, rare earth elements that we need to make cell phones. And the supplies of the minerals in these nodules are enormous, a world supply for many decades of many of these essential metals.
One important element of this project is to evaluate the extent to which communities on seamounts or at shallower depths within each no mining zone can serve as sources of larvae to recolonize communities on the abyssal plain. And so that's one of the important routes for reestablishment of these communities after mining. And so one aspect we've been doing is sampling larvae and also looking at connectivity and species overlap between communities in these distinct habitats.
At depths of 4,000 to 5,000 meters, or about 2 to 3 miles, the deep ocean is extremely difficult to sample. It's a very remote habitat. We're using a variety of state-of-the-art techniques, such as benthic landers and remotely operated vehicles.
A real technological workhorse of our project is the remotely operated vehicle Lu'ukai. This descends to the bottom of the ocean with video cameras and manipulators and collects the animals that we need to study, as well as the sediment samples that contain the diverse microbes.
Among the most numerous and diverse inhabitants of the deep sea are microorganisms.
yet they're chronically difficult to study. The approach that we are taking for this project is to study their genetic blueprint in order to better understand some of the ways that they obtain energy and recycled material in the deep sea. The remotely operated vehicle is a marvelous tool because it allows you to target individual organisms, slurp them up into a chamber undamaged, or pick up sea cucumbers very gently with this manipulator and drop it into a box. We're able to collect all kinds of animals that have never been collected before in this part of the ocean.
Although we're sampling microbes and taking lots of animal samples to look at what is there, what species are there, we're also trying to ask questions about what are the animals and the microbes actually doing in the sediments. And for this we're using seafloor landers, benthic chamber landers, and also what are called microprofiling landers. And these allow us to measure respiration rates, see how much the animals and the microbes are breathing at the seafloor, and also allow us to track how much food they process at the seafloor that we can then compare to other areas and build up an idea of how the ecosystem is functioning.
Baited cameras are a very useful tool to sample the mobile top predators in these ecosystems. So here we have one of the most common animals in the deep sea, a rat-tail fish that have long tapering tails that some early scientists thought looked like a rat's tail. At the seamounts, we found swarms of eels, a species that we're not sure of just yet. These are animals that are akin to lions and cheetahs on the plains of Africa. But because these animals, such as rat tails and eels, because they're so mobile, oftentimes they avoid the ROV. So the baited camera system gives us a tool to attract them right in front of our instruments to census them. So often with natural resource management, we end up chasing our tail. The activity starts, and then we come up with a plan for how to manage it and how to conserve the resource. This has happened with fisheries, it's happened with mining on land, and it's very unusual here because these reserves have been set up before the deep sea mining has begun. So we hope through our research to evaluate whether these reserves are adequate preservation areas for the region. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. It probably does a better job explaining some of this than my speaking, but I just want to end with a couple more slides here, and then I'm happy to take questions if there's any time. All of what I've talked about and what I showed you in that video focuses on the seafloor, but it turns out that many mining companies plan to discharge unwanted mud and seawater up into the water column in the midwaters. And so this diagram here shows the collections on the bottom, the pipe up to the ship, and then a shorter pipe with the discharge creating a cloud. And so that's going to be noisy. There's going to be nodules rattling up these pipes, and there's going to be these sediment plumes in the water column. We think that there's going to be a discharge of about 50,000 cubic meters a day of muddy seawater. A 20-foot shipping container holds about 50 cubic meters. So this is about a freight train, 1,000-car freight train worth of muddy water a day for one activity. And there's also going to be metals in this plume because they're breaking up the nodules, which of course are metals. And so there may be dissolved copper and cobalt and other things. So we don't exactly know how big these plumes are going to be yet, and we're engaged in some modeling efforts to figure that out, but something on the order of 10 to 100 kilometers in size. And the water column also hosts amazing diversity of animals. These are gelatinous organisms. There are incredible different types of plankton, squids, fishes. And so we're not just concerned about the seafloor, is my point in just bringing these slides here to you in the last. I recently wrote a paper on these potential effects, and the muddy seawater may clog the gills of fishes and other animals. It might reduce their feeding rates. A lot of animals in the water create their own light. They're bioluminescent. And so it might reduce their capability to visually communicate with one another. And all of those individual effects will sum up to population level effects. And those might cause changes to the ecosystem services that we rely upon, such as fisheries, carbon transport, biodiversity. Indeed, under natural conditions, I forgot I had one more data figure in here. This is mercury concentration versus how deep these open ocean fishes forage, and they include things like tunas and swordfish. And this is under natural conditions. We've found that mercury is more abundant in fishes which dive and feed deep. It turns out that the deep midwaters are a natural entry point for metals into the seafood supply. So if we discharge muddy water that's got more metals in it, are we actually contaminating our seafood supply? We don't know the answer to that just yet, but it's a real possibility. So I just want to end with a question to everyone. Society needs to decide, under what circumstances could deep sea mining occur? Many argue we really need these metals for our renewable energy technologies, for our electronics, but clearly there are a number of environmental risks. So I'd like to acknowledge, I don't have time to go through everybody here, but many colleagues, students, technicians, and a lot of different funding agencies over the years that have contributed to the work we've engaged in. And I, again, just want to give a big mahalo to ARCS. The support that you provided me when I was in graduate school was just wonderful. You do, so you have such a great mission and do so much good by supporting graduate students. Just thank you very much. And I'll take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. That was really interesting. I mean, some of those creatures, new to me. I've never seen them, even though I do watch a lot of the Planet Earth series. There's one question here in the chat box. What areas of the US government are involved in this type of mining / standards, rules, etc.?
Well, that's actually a very interesting question. You see, the United States did not sign on to the Law of the Sea, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. We are one of the only nations that has not. And so we don't have a seat at the table, not a voting seat. We have observers that travel to the International Seabed Authority meetings, but we don't have a vote. It's kind of crazy. We didn't sign on to that convention because of the US's concern that it would limit access to the oceans, but now it's limiting our ability to be involved in these discussions.
So it leads to the next question, I guess. How else would we get these metals?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. First of all, there still are terrestrial deposits. There still are metals on land. And I constantly hear companies or those interested in deep sea mining say, well, you know, we must protect the children that are the child laborers in those mines in Congo. My reaction is, if you're about to spend $2 billion developing technology to mine the deep sea floor, why don't you invest that in Congo and help fix their social problems there? And so we can actually have some sustainable mines and a, good socioeconomic condition in Congo. So I think there are other sources of these metals. Recycling also will play a big part, but perhaps not in the early days, because if you look at how much resource we need to make batteries for like electric cars, we don't have enough in the supply chain as it is to recycle. So we do need to extract some new resource. I'm just not convinced it has to come from the deep sea.
Well, a question: how difficult, dangerous, and expensive is land mining compared to deep sea mining?
It's much less difficult. In terms of danger, probably similar, because people won't actually go down to the seafloor. It'll all be robotic vehicles, right? So I think that that's similar. People would argue that mining on land, particularly in places like Congo, where they use child laborers, of course, has much more danger to people, but that's a practice that needs to be fixed in itself. It's not inherent to the technology.
Here's an interesting question. You talked about the ingestion of metals by fish that dive deep into the deep sea area. Are scientists thinking that the main source of mercury in, for example, tuna is actually natural from the deep sea and not due to man-made pollution?
Oh, that's a great question. No, it actually is from man-made pollution. What happens is the mercury is released and aerosolized when we burn coal, during our industrial processes. Those particles go up into the atmosphere. They settle on the surface of the ocean, but they're not the form of mercury that organisms can actually take up into their bodies yet. And that process, it's called methylation, that occurs in the deep ocean. And we're still trying to figure out why it happens there. It probably has to do with oxygen levels and the kinds of bacteria that convert that mercury into a bioavailable form. But that happens at depths of about 400 to 800 meters. And so that's why we see a lot these really high mercury levels. Microbes convert the mercury, the plankton consume particles that have that converted mercury on it, and it just makes its way right up the food web and into us, potentially.
What technological challenges must be overcome in order to make the mining plume and the tailing plume smaller? Some baffling on the mining vehicle and a longer pipe to deposit the tailing plume beginning at a lower depth, for example?
Yes.
Better to make many small mines over a broader area, or focus the mining in smaller areas?
So there are engineers working on this. They have asked and come to scientists and asked a lot of questions. It's very clear to the engineers that they need to minimize the sediment plumes as much as possible, and they are working on that. We haven't seen any of these vehicles at work other than the Japanese one that I showed you. They're very close vested about the results of their study, and I can't tell you any details because all of this tech is very, very closely guarded. I am involved in a company that is developing a vehicle. We're doing the environmental work for them. And so we'll be out in 2022 in the Clarion-Clipperton zone when they do test mining, and we'll be monitoring how big the clouds are and what that does to the animals that live up in the water column. So I hope to have a better answer for you as to what engineering can do for us to minimize these clouds of mud. But I don't know right now.
Here's a last question, I think. What countries are the leaders in this mining?
Right now, the United Kingdom, Germany, Belgium, China, and the company that I have an environmental contract with right now is called Deep Green Metals, and they're sponsored by the island nation of Nauru, but the company itself is in Australia, or in Canada. Sorry, some of the people work in Australia, but they're located in Canada.
And then there's a thank you here from a fellow Scholar Alum. Do you remember Henry Carson? He was a scholar in the mid-2000s. I guess that was after you. And he enjoyed the presentation, and he's happy to have been invited. So thank you, Hank. He goes by Hank, for joining us. I think we're going to move now to Channing. But if anybody has a question, it's still not too late to pose it. Just put it in the chat, and we'll address it a little later. So thanks again, Jeff.
Thank you.
We really enjoyed it. Channing, so we went from an early ARC scholar to now one of our newest ARC scholars. Channing is one of our 2020-2021 scholars. He's a PhD student studying physical oceanography at Scripps Institution of Oceanography with Sarah Gilla and Lynn Talley. He is currently focused on the exchange of heat and carbon dioxide between the ocean and atmosphere, which regulates the global climate system. He uses measurements from autonomous robotic floats, as well as satellite data and numerical models, to research how ocean circulation contributes to patterns of biological productivity and carbon uptake in the Southern Ocean, which surrounds Antarctica. This region plays an outsized role in the global ocean circulation and carbon cycle, and thus studying these processes is crucial to improving climate models and future climate projections. Today, Channing is joining us from Paris, where he's working with collaborators at l'Océan, the French National Oceanographic Research Institution, to prepare for a research cruise to the Southern Ocean. And in fact, he will be departing on this adventure from Cape Town shortly after this meeting, I think a day or two. So Jeff, if you'll stop sharing your screen, I think, have you done that? Okay, then Channing, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm very honored to receive the invitation to speak. And as Ingrid mentioned, I am in Paris right now, and I'm actually used some of the ARCS award to fund this travel. So I can say quite literally that I would not be here without the ARCS Foundation. So thank you very much for all of your support. And today I am going to be discussing how we observe the Southern Ocean with autonomous robotic floats. So the Southern Ocean, as Ingrid mentioned, is the ocean that surrounds Antarctica. So we just heard about one remote part of the ocean, the deep sea, and now we're going to be talking about another remote part of the ocean, which is the Antarctic. So here is an animation which is showing the surface velocity in the Southern Ocean from a climate model. So Antarctica is at the top of your screen. Here's the tip of South America, where I will be shortly. And we can see that this is a very energetic region of the ocean with very strong currents. And the circulation of the Southern Ocean is actually quite unique. And that's because this is the only place on the planet where there are no continental boundaries impeding the flow. And so we get a single current, which we call the Antarctic circumpolar current, that actually flows all the way around the entire world and connects waters between the different ocean basins. And so in addition to this really important role in interbasin exchange, the Southern Ocean is also one of the few places on the planet where waters are exchanged between the surface and the deep ocean. And so because of that, this region sequesters heat and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the deep ocean, where it can be stored on long timescales. And so because of this, the Southern Ocean really plays a key role in regulating the entire climate system. But as you can imagine, observing the Southern Ocean and collecting measurements there is quite challenging. So just to give you a little taste of this, here's a video showing what it's like at sea in the Southern Ocean during a storm. It is a little bit scary, to be honest, as I know firsthand, having spent nearly 90 days at sea in the Southern Ocean over the course of my PhD. So there you can see what it's like during a storm there. So the Southern Ocean is one of the most remote and challenging places to collect oceanographic data. And so despite its importance to the global circulation and global climate, it's one of the places that has the least number of historical measurements. So here, these maps are showing the distribution of data. So this is where we have measurements of the surface ocean PCO2, or the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So the first map on the left is showing all of the measurements that were ever taken from ships of the PCO2 between 1980 and 1989. And you can see in that whole decade, there was only a handful of measurements taken at all. And then as you kind of progress from left to right in each of these maps, it's showing the data distribution over the subsequent decades. And so you can see that the coverage has gotten better over time, although what the colors are showing is the number of unique months. And so what that means is places that are red in these maps are places where we have year-round observations, so 12 unique months. And so what you can see is that even though the coverage has gotten better, for the most part, that there's only a few places where we're actually observing year-round in the Southern Ocean, even today. And the reason that this is a problem is because physical and biogeochemical processes in the ocean are multi-scale. So they're occurring across a very wide range of space and time scales. So for example, sort of at the right in this diagram, this is sort of representing processes that are happening sort of at the large planetary scale. So things like the Antarctic Circumpolar Current or the Gulf Stream. But there are smaller scales where there are eddies and fronts and filaments and waves and all the way down to microscale turbulence. And those scales are all interacting with each other. And so what that means is that if we want to understand how the ocean is changing, say, in response to climate change, then we need to also know about the internal variability that's occurring within the system, which is the sum of these interactions between all of these different scales. And so if we want to really understand the ocean's ability to regulate the future climate, then we need to have observations year-round, and particularly so in the Southern Ocean. So that's just kind of some importance of why we need more measurements. And so the question is, well, what if we could get more measurements and do so from the comfort of San Diego or anywhere in the world? And so that's where we come to these autonomous floats. So this is a part of a very large project funded by the National Science Foundation that involves Scripps, Institution of Oceanography, where I'm studying, as well as people at the University of Washington, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, and Princeton University. And so what this project, which is called SOCOM, it stands for the Southern Ocean Carbon Climate Observations and Modeling Program, is that they have been deploying these autonomous robotic floats since 2014. And so this is just a picture on the left of what one of these floats looks like. Then below that, there's a picture of me right before I deployed one of these floats on a previous research cruise. And then the other picture here is actually showing a little drawing that we did on the float. So middle school and elementary school students can actually adopt the floats and name them. So that's just a little drawing that I did on one of the floats. So these floats, what they actually measure is the temperature, salinity, pressure, oxygen, nitrate, pH, fluorescence, and backscatter. So these are the different fields that are measured, and we use these to estimate things such as phytoplankton biomass, dissolved carbon, as well as even air-sea CO2 fluxes. And so now this map on the right is showing the distribution of all of the floats that are out there right now. So there's almost 200 of them, which were started being deployed in 2014, but have been just increasing the number of floats since then. And I'll be out there deploying a dozen more. And so what this float array has done is dramatically increase the spatial and temporal coverage of subsurface biogeochemical data in this region. So the floats, they just drift around wherever the ocean currents take them. And then every 10 days, they take a profile over the top 2,000 meters of the water column, measuring all of these different fields. And just to give you a little taste of the type of science that we do with these measurements, Here is a figure from a paper that is currently in review that I wrote, where basically what I've done is estimated the air CO2 fluxes using this data. So each one of these circles on this map is the location where a float profile was collected, and then they're colored by the air CO2 flux that I estimated from the float measurements. So red is wherever the ocean is actually releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and then blue is where the ocean is absorbing atmospheric CO2. And so one of the things that is quite striking from this map is that in the net, we think of the Southern Ocean as a carbon sink, which is true, but you can actually see here that there are large swaths of the ACC where you have red. So that's where the ocean is actually releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And this is something that scientists have known about for many decades. It's called carbon outgassing. But one of the things that the floats showed was that actually the magnitude of this carbon outgassing is much larger than was previously thought. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that most of the outgassing occurs in winter time, when measurements are extremely challenging to obtain in the Southern Ocean. And as you saw from that previous map, there are only a few locations where we have year-round measurements before these floats were deployed. So that's the first reason why the floats showed more outgassing. And then the second reason is because most of this outgassing is actually occurring in the Pacific sector of the Southern Ocean, which is the ocean basin that is the least well observed in the Antarctic. So the Atlantic actually has the highest uptake per unit area, and that's where we have the most measurements. So this really shows how the increased spatial and temporal coverage provided by the floats, which can collect measurements year-round, as well as in these hard-to-reach places, even under sea ice, can lead to new discoveries about the amount of carbon dioxide that is being absorbed by the oceans. Then quickly, I'll just touch on another application of the float data. So here is a study that I led that looked at productivity under sea ice. So the floats can actually collect measurements under the ice in contrast to other sampling methods. And so the map on the left is showing sea ice concentration from satellites, and then chlorophyll, which is a proxy for phytoplankton biomass. And so this is showing this large polynya event, so a hole in the sea ice that occurred in 2017 and was associated with high biological productivity. And so we actually had floats sampling in this location at that time. And one of the things that we showed in the study is that although phytoplankton bloom initiation is closely linked to the sea ice retreat timing, the biomass actually starts to accumulate months before that in winter when the mixed layer is deepening because that resupplies nutrients to the upper ocean. And so this study would not have been possible without these under ice measurements, which are really provided by the floats. And so I'll just kind of try to summarize some of the conclusions that I hope you will take away from this talk. The first is that the Southern Ocean, so the ocean surrounding the Antarctica, even though it may seem remote from where we all live, it actually plays a disproportionate role in the global ocean circulation and the oceanic uptake of heat and CO2. But it is one of the hardest places to collect data. And so because physical and biogeochemical processes in the ocean occur over such a wide range of space and timescales, we need more measurements in order to understand the internal variability within the ocean, which is necessary in order to determine the longer term trends associated with climate change. And so one way to increase that number of measurements is through these autonomous observing systems, such as these floats, which already just in the past 5 to 6 years have dramatically increased the number of measurements that we have in the Southern Ocean, and already has led to new insights about the global carbon cycle, primary productivity, and sea ice processes, There's been over 150 scientific papers published just in the past 6 years using this data set. And they just got funding to actually expand the float array globally. So the number of questions that we're able to ask with this data is only going to increase in the future. So with that, I will just say thank you again to everyone at ARCS for helping fund this work, as well as the National Science Foundation, Scripps, and SOCOM. I'm happy to take any questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Channing. I don't see any questions yet in the chat box. Maybe, yes, there is one. Do the autonomous floats stay in the water very long?
Yes, so that's a great question. So the floats, they take a profile every 10 days and their lifetime lasts about 6 years. So that's actually, in terms of the cost of a float to the number of profiles that it gets, it's dramatically cheaper than collecting data on a ship because ship time is very expensive. So yeah, so the floats will typically be collecting data for around 6 years.
And who are your collaborators?
Yeah, so SOCOM is a huge program that's funded by NSF. So along with my PhD advisors, who are two of the PIs on the project, at Scripps, we also collaborate with many professors from different institutions, including the University of Washington, Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, and Princeton University.
Are the floats retrieved after the 6 years or earlier or more frequently?
So the floats are actually never retrieved. So they will contribute to plastic waste in the ocean, although the amount of plastic that has been added into the ocean due to these floats is less than the amount added by humans in one day. And that's over many years. So yeah, so that's one of the environmental costs of doing research, actually. Because the amount of carbon that it would take to actually try to recover the floats on a ship would contribute more emissions than the waste associated with just letting the floats battery die. So yeah, so the floats are actually never recovered, but there has been a lot of analysis to suggest that that contributes very little to the total plastic waste in the ocean.
So let's make this the last question, and there is concern for your safety. Are the research ships well designed to prevent the possibility of becoming capsized?
Yes, they are. And so I have been on a research ship during a storm with 30-meter swell, and we were perfectly fine, although it was a bit harrowing. I was questioning my life decisions at the time, but it's a lot of fun being out there.
So I think then the thing to say is to wish you a safe and successful voyage to the Southern Ocean. Before you and Jeff sign off, though, I want to ask you to stay on for 1 minute, because I'm going to turn this over now to, I believe, Ann Siemens, who's going to tell us about the next field trip planned for ARCS. Which will be in February, and it will be to Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So Anne, are you the one that will take over from here, or is it it Margaret?
Actually, this is Holly, and I think it's going to be Ann Hill. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. But before I introduce Ann, I would like to thank both of our speakers so much. Jeff and Channing, your talks were just amazing. And I must say that the ocean is a well-kept secret. Jeff, when you mentioned that there's more mapping of the moon than the ocean floor, it just amazed me. It also amazed me that the US doesn't have a bigger part in this. But both of you, thank you so much for your time and expertise and beautifully put together slides and presentations today. It was just a pleasure for all of us, and something that we would like to share with the other ARCS chapters in the country, because your work is so interesting and so deserving of a spotlight, especially on the dark ocean floor, right? Right, Jeff? anyway, I really appreciate you and the time that you've spent giving us this very, very great program this morning. So thank you. And now I would like to turn the floor over to Ann Hill. I saw her here somewhere. And Ann, welcome back. I know you've been in St. Louis for a couple of months, and it's good to have you back with us and to have you tell us about our next field trip. But before I do that, I did want to send a special hello greeting to BJ Williams. BJ is with us here today. And she's a long-term member. She's very well known in San Diego as being a supporter of ARCS and of the zoo and of Sharp Healthcare, just to name a few. But BJ is here via LA today. She's up in LA near her daughter. And we're just so pleased that she could be with us here today. As Ingrid said earlier, this is one of the silver linings of COVID. And there aren't too many. So let's appreciate the ones we have. And now, Ann Hill, take it away.
Thank you, Holly. I reiterate, what a marvelous program, absolutely fascinating. And thank you so much for all that involved in getting that prepared for us. I am still in St. Louis. I'm heading back to San Diego soon. So again, there are benefits of the Zoom climate that we're in right now. And so I'm so pleased to say that our February virtual field trip is going to be to the lab of ARCS scholar Jessica Ng, and she also is at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And her research is about weather patterns. So we've learned about the deep, deep sea and how that can affect the weather patterns. And so we'll learn more about that in February. I want to give special thanks to Suzanne Dixon, University Relations, and Ingrid, again, for reaching out to UCSD's SIO to connect the events committee with our current scholar there, Jessica. And the Zoom event date is proposed for Thursday, February 25th from 10 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. And the other details will be confirmed and determined. But please do save that date, February 25th at 10 a.m. And you're free to invite guests. We encourage you to invite guests. I think it's so marvelous how we're sharing our programs such as today with our other ARCS chapters across the United States. It just makes us all so proud to be part of ARCS. And our alumni and scholars will also be invited. And the presentation will be posted, as I mentioned, on the ARCS website under past events after the presentation. So if for some reason you miss it, you can go onto the website and look at it later on and share it with your friends. So thank you for all the work that's gone into that. And thank you again for today. It was really amazing. So best wishes on your work going forward.
Thank you so much, Ann. That was a lovely introduction to what will be another fascinating field trip, and a safe travels back from St. Louis next week.